Developers should be responsible for the code that they're writing. But what if you are a non-tech founder or you haven't read the code? How do you know what's actually implemented right now? That's why I made this checklist that we're discussing in this video. But before we do, I want to show you a blog post that I read this morning that made me make this video. A few days ago, I went to a cafe near my home. I sat down and scanned the QR code on the table. It took me to a website displaying the cafe's menu. It asked for my name and WhatsApp mobile number. I entered the details and placed the order, and in 5 minutes, the order arrived on the table without any verification. So then this person went into the QR code, looked at the website and saw what's happening. And on the website, there's some calls being made to an API. Okay, so now the weird thing is that the person could see the purchase history, and basically not only for that history, because there's a merchant in the store ID, he would be able to change the store IDs and then query the items, the purchase history of other restaurants as well. And so this person ended up making a list of purchased food items. He made a list of like a stats of what, there's some crazy numbers here. What are the best performing restaurants? Because he could query all the restaurants, and he would even see customer numbers, like their WhatsApp numbers and their names, and even how much they ordered. So they could figure out how much one person ordered. Of course, this is crazy. And this happens because the website didn't have good authorization. I will explain this in this post. The way you can use this checklist, and by the way, you can download it from our website, tillcarlos.com. You use this by just taking it, copying it, and sending it over to your developer and ask them to fill it out. And of course, if you download it, you don't have these black bars. We're going to use them to uncover the next steps. Important is this: when you ask them to fill out these questions, the questions contain what's the worst case scenario. And this really should make the developer think. And especially these are important. They should answer the questions first. They should tell you what should be improved. And also then what is the worst case that can happen. And that should really open their mind up to the possibility of how can the system get abused. Okay, let's get into the first point. The basics. We want to talk about common attacks like SQL injection. How can the system get penetrated from a user or even from a visitor? What are endpoints public to the internet? So for example, sometimes a developer might open a logging system and expose it to the internet, or they don't have a VPN for these services. We should know. How often do we update our software stack? Sometimes there are vulnerabilities in the packages that we're using, and those should be updated in order to have the newest version. Usually contains all the bug fixes, so we should have those updated. Okay, then the checklist goes into authentication. Authentication is the act of knowing who a visitor is. So someone on the internet, we can know this person is that user account. So usually that's just being done by user and password. And the question here are, how are the passwords stored? If they're stored in plain text, that's a huge problem. But also, how can you create users and how do you reset passwords? Important questions for the developers. The next point is authorization. So authorization is the act of making sure a certain user with certain roles only works on the database entries that they're assigned to. Let's uncover this. So what we want to list is, what are the roles in the application? You need to know how many different roles you have. For example, admins and users and visitors. Maybe there are more. Maybe there's a manager or some shared accounts. Those things should be clear. And then also, how can you promote roles? Are these endpoints? So there's usually a method in the software that would make a user get promoted, let's say to an admin. Who can do that? If the user can do it to themselves, that's a huge problem. What we are using in the Ruby world is something called action policy. And the way it works is that for every database record, we are writing a policy that says this user or this role can work on this model, and this other ones cannot. So for example, can you update a post? Only if you are the owner or if you're the admin. And then we have to check those all the time. And people always forget this. Not always, but sometimes developers, they would forget that they need to place these authorization lines everywhere. And every software needs to do that. And I've not seen a framework that does this automatically. It's just something that needs to get done manually. So authorization is a super important thing. Then the next point is APIs. Do we have a rate limit? And then is also authorization done on the API? The next point we have is monitoring. And important for monitoring is that Do we actually know that how the system is performing right now? Do we have errors? Where are errors sent to? Where are logs sent to? And who gets notified if there are any issues? And then we have backups. Where are the backups stored? Who has access to the backups? And how often are they performed? And just as a reminder, if my list here is not comprehensive, if something is missing, then this second column here should take care of that. So your developer should then be able to add a couple of more steps here. Okay, let's talk about data. Do we have any sensitive data that we don't encrypt in the database? Do we store passwords? Maybe not user login passwords, but maybe we have passwords that hit other APIs. Are we storing them in an encrypted way? Do we have data that help us debug any issues later? And then also, how is data used in non-production environments? So sometimes the developer might take a database dump from the production environment just to test something locally. It's important to know if the developer did that, if they can even actually do that, and that they for sure make sure that they delete the data again. The next thing is deployment. How does deployment work? Who can trigger a deployment? And then how long does it take? And who has access to that? Who can even click the button to make a new version? You for sure don't want a developer who's going on a Friday evening before he logs off to work, makes a new version and uploads it. So there should be something where you agree on how often these releases are done and that you test them before. And then let's talk about secrets. So secrets are something that we would store in the software in order to access, let's say, third-party APIs or any system settings or database passwords. So it's important, where are they stored, who has access to them, and how can we update them? Sometimes they're on the developers' machines, and that should not be like that. They should be they should only be there for specific DevOps people who can then manage the servers. It should not be for every developer. The next thing is software packages. What is the version of the language and the framework that we're using? What are the packages we are using? So usually a software has something called, for example, a gem file. A gem file is something where you would write down all the packages that you're using in the software. So for example, here you put this in here. So you know you're using Nokogiri, Rails, Rag, and Thin. And there is other things, for example, Peep for Python. And then there are a lot of package managers for all kinds of software stack. And it's important to know what are the things we're actually depending on. And then how often do we update them? And do we get notified if there are any vulnerabilities? Because these things often compromise software. So for example, we use GitLab, a self-hosted version of GitLab in our company. And quite often there's some vulnerabilities in packages. And then GitLab makes a new version and you need to update very fast. Because if you don't do that, then you're susceptible to attacks where crawlers or hackers, they just try different installations of GitLab and just see if some of them were not updated. And this happens a lot with WordPress, and that's why it's important to always update the packages. The next thing is third-party integrations. Do we rely on some APIs, and if they break, will our software break then as well? And how can we monitor them? Is there even a security threat from them? And then I just placed this in here, anything else. Is there anything else we should know? Because maybe my list is not completely finished. Maybe there's something that the developer wants to add. It's important to give them the possibility to give feedback to you. And then how this would work is that you take this list, once you're sure that the software actually works, that you can make money with that, then you slowly implement these measures. And the most important thing is prioritize them and give the developer time to work on them. If you never give the developer time, then those things will not get implemented. And then at one point, maybe the software could break. If you want to get the checklist, go to my website, tilkarls.com, or send me an email. I'm going to send it over to you.